Imagine this. Just 50 years ago, no one had ever seen the Earth.
People say to me, I wonder what it'd be like to be on a spaceship. And I say to you, you don't really realize what you're doing, because everybody is an astronaut.
5, 4, 3, 2, 1, 0. All engine running. Liftoff. We have a liftoff. 32 minutes past the hour. Tower clear.
Roger, roll. Complete and emissions program. One Bravo. Oh my God, look at that picture over there. There's the Earth coming up. Wow, that's pretty. You got a color film, Jim? Hand me a roll of color quick. Oh man, that's great. Where is it? Quick. Oh, I got it right. Oh, that's a beautiful shot.
One of the great revelations in my lifetime that have come out of science that will be spoken about 3,000 years hence occurred on Christmas Eve of 1968 when Apollo went around the dark side of the moon. And for the first time in human history, we saw not a sunrise or a moonrise, but an earthrise. And in that sort of sudden moment of illumination, we saw that we were not an infinite horizon, we were a finite planet. We didn't go to space to acquire new wealth, but to return with a new vision of life itself. And in doing so, the whole paradigm shifted.
Ich denke, die Erfahrung, die ein jeder macht, der wie ich die Möglichkeit hatte, die Erde in so kurzer Zeit zu umfliegen, der wird sagen, dieser Eindruck, den kann man mit Sprache eigentlich nur mangelhaft beschreiben. Man sieht eine schwarze Welt, denn das alles leer. Es ist das finsterste Schwarz, das man sich nur denken kann. Und dann in der Nähe eben die Erde, die einem mit ihrer Schönheit völlig überwältigt. Aber gleichzeitig hat man auch den Eindruck, es ist alles zerbrechlich. Gekrümmter Horizont ist gesäumt von einer hinreißend schönen blauen Schicht, die aber sehr dünn ist und auch zart und zerbrechlich wirkt. Und diese Fakten, die ändern die Wahrnehmung. Hat man vorher die Erde als so riesig gesehen, dass sie im Grunde die Vorstellungskraft überfordert. Man kann sie ja nicht als Kugel wahrnehmen. Dann sieht man plötzlich die Erde als ein Raumschiff, mit dem wir alle im leeren Weltraum unterwegs sind.
Our scientists have had half a century to analyze our ship as a whole. Now, for the first time, they can see where we've come from and where we're going.
For many centuries, we were gazing outside of the planet. And this made us think in a different way about God, humanity, power, what's our destiny, and so on. It was the outside look that created modernity, if you like. And in a sense, if we look back onto Earth from outer space, which is only possible if you have a space vessel, rockets, things like that, then you may start to think differently about our planet, what we are doing to the planet, what we are doing to ourselves. So I guess it's clearly a paradigm shift. I think the last 50 years have been, in particular, advancement in systems thinking, quite generally. Yeah? Many disciplines have not yet understood that. They still think, reducing in size and in focus and so on is the progress of science. But it's the other way around, actually. The progress of science after the last decade was taking the pieces and integrating them back to a holistic understanding. Yeah? Modern science is systems science.
でこれだけど宇宙船地球号っていうことの概念は本当は何なのかと。ですから有限のこういう一つの乗り物に乗り合わせていて、この乗り物がどんな乗り物なのかっていうことですよね。地球システムっていうのは大気があり海がありね、地圏と言いますけれども、大陸近くとか海洋近くとかマントルとかコアとか、こういうのを含めて例えば地圏と呼ぶとすると、地圏とか大気圏とか水圏とかね、あるいは生物圏とか、こういうものが複雑に相互作用しながら地球という星ができてるわけですよ。ね、要するに地球っていう星を研究しようと思ったら全部を一つの結合したね体系として見なきゃいけないと。全て関係してるんですよ。
It's a long-lived planet. It's either a very lucky planet or it's self-regulating in some way. This is one system which will have system properties which you can't analyze by looking just at the biology or just at the physics. We now know that there are some negative feedback type mechanisms that keep the planet Earth relatively stable, that help to stabilize the planet. And they do involve living organisms.
地球ができた時はドロドロに溶けた地球とでその上を覆うですね熱い原始大気とこういう2つの構成要素からできているようなものです。現在の生物と似たような、その一番元になるようなものがたくさん生まれてくるのが今から20億年ぐらい前のことです。でその結果ですね、地表付近には、生物が作り出す環境が生まれます。具体的には大気中に酸素が満ちてきます。
The sunlight has instigated the development of what is probably the biggest invention in the history of our planet, that is photosynthesis. So we can take an energy quantum from the sunlight, combine it with CO2, and then you can create sugar plus oxygen. And this is the basic formula for our evolution on this planet. Now, sugar means you can create biomass, of course. You can build higher forms of proteins. It's a long, long story, at least 1 billion years long.
Plants on the land, like the algae in the oceans, are acting as cooling agents for the planet. The atmosphere of Earth has 21% oxygen in it. And of course, it's that which enables large, complex animals to exist.
The interesting thing is, not only do you create oxygen, but you draw down the CO2 from the atmosphere. And you store it in biomass and so on. A tree will fall into water, so it cannot be oxidized again. And this tiny little part of carbon that is taken out of the natural cycle, that is the source of the so-called fossil fuels. And it takes 500 million years to 1 billion years to create that.
For most of our career as a species, we human beings got energy through the food that we ate, which grew from sunlight, or from animals that ate plants. And we also exerted energy into the environment by way of muscle power. Initially just our own muscles, and then with human slavery and by domesticating animals. So our use of energy was on a pretty rudimentary basis, really, until just the last couple of 100 years when we gained access to fossil fuels.
Back in 1850, which is really the Industrial Revolution, coal was about 18% of our energy supply at that point, and wood, biomass, was over 80%. In 1850, that's only 160 years ago, our only hydrocarbon, fossil hydrocarbon, was coal. Arguably, oil started in Canada in 1858. Oil is very unique. It's very dense. It's easy to store. It's easy to move around the world. If you project the amount of energy that's in a barrel of oil, that's about 6 billion joules of energy. And if you translate that into, how much work would that be for a human being to generate that much energy? I think it works out to in the order of 6 years. And if you had that person paid at US minimum wage, that barrel of oil would be worth, something like $140,000. That's how concentrated and valuable and useful oil is.
The fossil fuels have created our wealth. They've really created our civilization. They have enriched the lives of billions of people. In ancient times, fire made us human. In the past few hundred years, and fossil fuels made us modern.
Energy is the master resource. We're burning 88 million barrels of oil per day. That's the rate of supply that's required to run society. And as of the year of 2011, we'd burned about 1.2 trillion barrels of oil. What is stunning to me about that consumption is that 50% of it has been burned since 1988. So we're now burning 32 billion barrels of oil per year. We're not finding many billion barrel fields.
もともと工学系で、資源の探査ですとかこういうふうにその油田の状況をこうモニターをしていくとここに衛星がございますけれども宇宙からこれ600キロ700キロ上ですけれどもそうですねビフォーアフターなんですね。その最初の地表の状態を観測しておきまして次にこう生産に伴って、その後アフターという形で観測しますとこれはクウェートの世界第一、今2番ですかね、のブルガン油田というところですけれどもですね実は石油っていうのはどういうところにたまるかっていう非常にこう乱暴ですけれども当然その石油っていうのは少し水に比べると軽いですので生産をすると。ただ、その生産する際に、地面の下のこう通常石油を自噴してくるものも多いんですけれどもその圧力の維持を図るために実は周りに別の井戸を掘りましてそこは実は水を圧入するとかですねそういうことをして地下のその圧力維持を図ってその真ん中の溜まってる石油をこう、いわばストローで吸い出すというその石油の生産のピークというのがもうすでに来たと。ということはラフに言って半分、使いを切ったという言い方もできるわけですね。
Fossil fuels also involve huge flows of money. The oil money often fuels tyranny, instability, and corruption. It is behind many of the conflicts in the world. We actually pay about 10 times more to sustain military forces meant to intervene in the Persian Gulf than we pay to buy oil from the Persian Gulf.
Conventional oil is already in decline. And we're going to have to find at least 3 Saudi Arabias worth of new conventional oil just to maintain that decline on a very, very shallow level going forward. There's a concept called energy return on energy investment. You have to use a certain amount of energy to drill a well, to build pipelines to produce the oil. The net energy yield of drilling a vertical well into the Ghawar field in Saudi Arabia back in the 50s was probably at least 100 to 1. So we invested a barrel of energy to net out 100 barrels of useful energy. Now we're looking on the last frontiers, very deep water. And so the net energy return on that is probably somewhere around 25 to 1. We're looking also at things like tar sands. Only 20% of the tar sands are shallow enough to be surface mineable, and that's about 5 to 1. 80% are only recoverable by so-called in situ methods that have a net energy return of about 2.9 to 1. We're burning a barrel to net out about 2 barrels of useful energy. We wouldn't be doing that if we had alternatives. If we look at shale oil, we have to find enough new production to make up for 40% decline every year to keep production flat. And that requires a lot of drilling and a lot of hydraulic fracturing. If you look at just the public pushback against the technology of fracking, it's very high.
Yes, you have different opinions. When they heard they were coming in, a number of people are excited because most of the people have leased their land. So I would say over 90% in our county are leased. So for them, it's just, I'm going to get extra money. And then there's others, like myself, who are very concerned about the industrialization and the contamination.
You know, my other half, she got all pissed off with me because I was fighting with them all the time. It's like, you know something? I'm trying to protect what we own from being destroyed. We already lost the water. And she was mad because I was constantly fighting with them. You know, her thing was, you know, just lay down and be a good little gas whore. And it's like, no. So she walked out on me. Then you have neighbors pissed off because you got signs in your yard, you're fighting the industry. You have other ones that from the town, well, there's nothing wrong with our water. Well, thank God for you, you don't have a problem. But over here, we do.
It's very controversial in our area. They drive neighbors against neighbors. People that normally wouldn't hate you because you have water problems now. And
they're drilling about 1,500 wells a year. They're going to run out of locations at some point.
There is a site right off to your right, and as we drive up here, you'll be able to see it. Straight down the runway, off to the left, there's a tower that's out there, and that's another drill rig. So the rig is drilling under the speedway. They can be fenced in, they can be concealed, they can be bermed up, plant trees around them. They're very nondescript. I mean, you can make them fit into pretty much any environment.
Oil production from the two biggest tight oil fields in the world will likely be a bubble that will last maybe 10 to 12 years. Consider that the oil that we're burning today took 500 million years to accumulate. 500 million years of solar energy preserved in that oil. And we're burning 32 billion barrels every year. That works out to about 5 million years worth of solar energy burned every year in terms of our oil consumption, and 14,000 years of solar energy every day. So that tells us one thing that's certain. This is a non-renewable, finite resource. It's finite in terms of the foreseeable lifespan of the human race as a species on this planet.
This is the big intervention. Homo sapiens has found a way to release the carbon back and to reoxidize it. That means you enhance the greenhouse effect in an artificial way, but at the same time you take away all this useful energy, because this energy would be useful for future generations as well, but we just consume it. We burn it, it's gone, and we cannot wait another 500 million years to build back.
先ほどちょっと郷さんと話しましたけども、これ CO2 の濃度ですので、観測してますのは大気中の微細な光に対する応答っていうものを見まして、で全体にいわゆる大気の中の CO2 の量を測っていくという、そういうタイプの技術になります。
One thing is completely certain, and that is that the carbon dioxide concentration in the atmosphere is rising anomalously fast. that rise is primarily due to what humans are doing. No one doubts that. Also, it is absolutely clear that extra carbon dioxide in the atmosphere produces extra warming. There's no controversy about that.
The situation has turned scientists into navigators, monitoring our direction. Their clearest observation window is the melting Arctic. No generation of scientists has faced a challenge so difficult, so important, or so exciting.
We've never seen a trajectory in the history of our species like the one we're on right now. We're the first life form to become a planet-scale influence and know it. We now, for the first time, have this ability to observe this stuff. Are we destined, like most species, when we hit a resource limit to have a jagged rebound period? Or can we, with this gift of foresight that we have, smooth it out consciously?
I started doing Arctic research in 1970 when the Navy decided to send the first British nuclear submarine to the Arctic. The director of the Scott Polar Research Institute persuaded them that it would be a very good thing to do scientific work and collect ice thickness data, so he pushed me forward as the person to do it. So I've been going on them for about 40 years now. We'd be going out in the winter months. The ice then was very formidable. Most of it was called multi-year ice. That's ice that survived more than 1 year. And it was very thick, maybe 3 meters thick, heavily ridged with these great piles of deformed ice. Nobody had managed to get to the North Pole in an icebreaker in those days because the ice was so heavy. In the last 15 years, the amount of multi-year ice has diminished, and now there's scarcely any left. Nearly all the ice that's in the Arctic in winter just grew that year. So it's very thin, it's only 1 meter or so thick. It doesn't have many ridges. It's easy to break through, so you can routinely go to the North Pole in an icebreaker now, crashing through this stuff. To somebody who's used to the Arctic as it was in the 70s and 80s, it's just a different world. The Arctic has warmed up about 3 times as fast as the planet as a whole. What happens in the Arctic is what's going to happen to the rest of the planet in a few years' time.
Nature has a certain order in everything that it does. As a result of warming, the bodies of ice will melt much faster. The oceans will expand because of the heat that they are absorbing, and therefore you will get sea level rise.
Complex nonlinear systems can behave in an abrupt way, and even worse, they can behave in an irreversible way. you have activated or transgressed a tipping point. You know, if you stand in front of an abyss and somebody gives you a push from behind, you may fall down. If this person, after you are falling already, would just take the hand back, doesn't help you in any way. You will not miraculously re-emerge and be put back onto the cliff. That's what we call a tipping point. The so-called Gulf Stream system in the ocean, where we have seen a slowdown over the last decades, quite a significant slowdown already. Could the Gulf Stream be shut down completely? Yes, it happened during the ice ages several times. With Greenland melting, there's a very high chance that not only its circulation will slow down in the North Atlantic, but it may be shut down completely. So that's another tipping element here, clearly. The situation for 3 or 4 years now in the United States, Canada, but you have extremely warm weather on the west coast and extremely cold weather on the east coast. This has to do very likely with the warming of the Arctic, the retreat of the sea ice, which is affecting what we call the jet stream. This is this ribbon of high-speed wind around the northern hemisphere. And in general, this jet stream is creating certain waves for a few days only, so-called Rossby waves. And what we find is with this disproportional Arctic warming, these Rossby waves get stuck. They can create unusual heat waves or the Californian drought. This is a big surprise for many people because they feel global warming means, oh, it's gradually getting warmer. But that our dynamical weather patterns are being reorganized through the perturbation of the jet stream, for example, in a highly nonlinear way by human interference, it's a completely different story. It's fascinating, but it's also terrifying.
Everywhere on the planet is now affected by human activities.
Well, one of the most obvious changes is that species are moving to higher elevations in mountains because it gets colder at higher elevations, and they're moving towards higher latitudes closer to the North Pole and the South Pole. And that, if you like, is the real kind of signal that it's driven by differences in the amount of warming in different regions rather than by some other factor which is changing in the environment. The best evidence is from Europe and North America because that's where there have been most volunteer amateur naturalists who've been recording the distributions of species for many, many years. If this rate of movement carries on for the next 100 or so years, which is the general expectation with climate warming, then the whole distributions of animals on the whole planet are going to move to somewhere else from where they used to be. So this is just a major rearrangement of the whole of biological life on Earth. If there's no more habitat available, then they'll get kind of squeezed as they will be failing to expand in the north, but they will be retreating in the south.
A number of organisms now are very sensitive to these changes.
So 500 billion tons of carbon dioxide has been taken up by the oceans. We now understand that over time, that has caused a 30% increase in the acidity of the oceans. And we'll start this model now. The first thing you begin to see is more changes in high latitudes because more CO2 goes into the water at high latitudes. See changes in the Arctic and the Antarctic region first, but now we're out to the present. And as you go out to the end of the century, we see that the entire Arctic Ocean and parts of the North Atlantic and the North Pacific are now corrosive from top to bottom. That means shells and skeletons would dissolve from top to bottom. The same thing is true for the Antarctic region here, all the way out to Australia and parts of South America. But even in the tropical zone, there are conditions no longer favorable for corals to produce their shells or skeletons. This is what the shell normally looks like, completely clear. This is what happens when you put it into 1100 microatmosphere CO2 for 30 days. Look how dissolved the shell is. We see a slow down the rate of growth of corals, and perhaps 25% or more of the fish that live in the oceans spend some time of their life in a coral reef habitat. Some fish, for example, the clownfish, they actually move towards their predators in the high CO2 world as opposed to avoiding their predators. They do this because the CO2 has an impact on their neural receptors, and so the fear response they have is just the opposite of what it should be. And there are other organisms that do well in a high CO2 world. For example, jellyfish. So you could see there'd be a whole shift in the ecosystem. In our planet, about 1 out of every 7 people, on average, rely on seafood for protein in their diet.
魚痛かって全然取れんがな。もうクラゲ出すだけや。
およそ地球全体で4000万あるいは5000万ぐらいのですね、生き物がいるんではないかというふうに言われています。研究者の人が今まで調べたそういう生物種だけでもですね、生物種というのはわずか200万しかないんですね。でつまり私たちは全体のわずか 5% しかですねまだ知らないということなんです。一番問題なのはですね、この生き物がものすごい勢いで絶滅しているということなんです。で実際調べてみるとですね、例えば地球上の哺乳類のうちのですねすでに4分の1がですね絶滅が心配されています。で今まで過去地球の歴史の中でですねどの時点に比べてもですね、最低でも1000倍場合によってはですね1万倍ぐらいのスピードでこの変化が起きているというふうに言われているんですね。
George DeVoke is witnessing extinction in real time. He's spent 40 years in Alaska studying guillemots. The seabirds eat the Arctic codfish that live under pack ice.
The ice was pulling offshore and taking their food away. And then I started seeing these major die-offs of chicks in the nests. Polar bears are obviously the best known and most iconic part of the pack ice ecosystem. If you see a polar bear, you are seeing X number of Arctic cod that have been eaten by a seal, and then that seal's been eaten by the bear.
I slept in a tent with nothing other than my shotgun, and frequently not even unpacked because I never saw a polar bear, for 28 years. And suddenly we had a mother with 2 full-grown cubs coming up to our tent site. After I got over my fear of polar bears, I started really feeling sorry for them. They swim in 150 miles or more. They then get to land, they're exhausted, they're looking for anything, and they are eating things like guillemot eggs and guillemot chicks. Male polar bears weigh from 800 to 1,200 pounds, and to have them be eating something as small as a guillemot egg, which is not as big as a hen's egg, makes you realize that they are very hard up for food. I didn't think I would be seeing the loss of a major ecosystem or seeing a species that basically has depended on that system for the past 25,000 years have to deal with the loss of that system.
The speed of global warming now depends on feedback loops we cannot control, like the thawing of permafrost.
The way it works is that permafrost gets warmer. The layer that thaws in the summer gets deeper and deeper every year, and the carbon that was stored in the permafrost for tens of thousands of years gets released to the atmosphere. Then that carbon, as greenhouse gas, influences the climate also, and it gets warmer. If the climate gets warmer, then we get like more thawing of that active layer in the summer. And the more thawing we have, then the more carbon get activated. So this is what we call the feedback loop, because like one process influences the other. And that goes on until probably all the carbon that is there stored in the permafrost is used to be released in the atmosphere.
Permafrost extends under all of the Arctic land masses, but it also extends out to sea. It's a kind of relic of the last ice age. If you have warm water, the water melts the seabed, the permafrost melts, and that releases methane because there's a lot of methane trapped under the subsea permafrost. And methane is a very, very powerful greenhouse gas. It's more than 20 times as powerful as carbon dioxide. So if you release a lot of methane into the atmosphere, you're going to accelerate global warming. And that's what seems to be happening at the moment.
But there's the methane coming out right there. That's a nice example. That was way up there.
Well, yes, warming events can be very harmful. Today, the world is just sort of starting to show signs of the conditions we saw at the end of the Permian. The end Permian mass extinction happened about 251 million years ago. It's probably killed around 95% of all species on Earth. And we start to think, well, how could a huge amount of volcanic activity cause a global mass extinction like this? And most of the interest focuses on not the lava itself, but the gases that come out with volcanism. I think the main culprit we think of is the carbon dioxide. It started to release methane. And so what we think happened at the end of the Permian is we get this sort of runaway greenhouse effect whereby we're getting these two gases, methane and carbon dioxide, warming up the planet. Before you know it, the world has just got so hot that it becomes extremely hard for life. And we see a sort of a mass dying of animals on land and in the sea exactly at the same time. We're just starting to see the start of that effect. Any report from the late Permian would say, yeah, be wary. Be careful, the world is starting to break down and losing its ability to cope with greenhouse gases. And the big unknown for us today is how fast things happen. Will this happen in 50 years? So will it happen in 5,000 years? Well, it's really hard to know.
É o que eu digo de uma crise civilizatória. E uma crise civilizatória não tem como ser enfrentada a não ser por todos. Uma mobilização de todo o tecido social na forma não apenas de um questionamento à nossa maneira inadequada de fazer as coisas, mas, sobretudo, um questionamento de natureza mais profunda à nossa forma inadequada de ser. É disso que se trata, e isso é válido para o Brasil, para o Japão, para Altamira ou para Nova York.
Our engineers are responding to the crisis, but every solution faces complications.
O Brasil tem uma abundância de rios. Nossa matriz energética, ela é basicamente feita pelo aproveitamento dos rios. Essa riqueza natural que nós temos de energia limpa e sustentável, nós usamos diferentemente do resto do mundo. O Brasil, 70% a 80% da nossa energia é energia hidroelétrica limpa. Nós temos a usina de Belo Monte, que é a maior, que é uma usina de 11.000 megawatts. Nós temos um canal de 16 quilômetros, enorme, um canal similar ou maior em escavação do que o canal do Panamá.
Belo Monte, ela não traz só um impacto ambiental, né? Mais do que o impacto ambiental, diria que se o Xingu é o coração do Brasil, e por essas condições, também na Volta Grande, você tem espécies únicas que não tem em nenhum outro lugar da Amazônia e em nenhum lugar do mundo, como, por exemplo, alguns peixes ornamentais, peixes maravilhosos que só existem nas condições que a Volta Grande proporciona.
Eu acho que não é 7 metros, até porque lá está aquela barreira lá, ó. A água vai lá no meu barraco, com a cheia sem a represa. Com a cheia sem a represa. Agora, essa madeira eu botei ainda agora. Tá aqui, ó. Pouquinho. Quando é muito, quando dá bastante, a gente tira 30, 50, 60 numa rede dessa. Demais, e pelo que tá vendo, vai ficar 0. Porque de primeiro a gente, para pegar uma caixa de peixe, não saía daqui para aquela ilha, ó. Até 200 carinha, agora tá aí o tanto, ó. Hoje, entendeu? Depois de todas essas... Hoje nós passamos 5 dias e não pega 3 caixas de 160.
Esse é um projeto muito complexo. Do ponto de vista social, há uma situação de alto impacto negativo para as populações locais? Aqui no Brasil, e eu particularmente, não temos uma posição ideológica contra as hidrelétricas. Elas são uma fonte de geração importante para o nosso país. Mas não podemos ficar refém de uma única fonte de geração. Existem muitas coisas que podem ser consideradas isoladas, como no caso da floresta amazônica ou no Nordeste. Mas também dentro das grandes metrópoles temos grandes dificuldades econômicas e sociais.
Iceland is the only industrialized nation that has come close to running entirely on renewable energy.
We are a volcanic active country that has the geothermal resources underneath to tap into. And what we do is we drill holes into that reservoir about 2 kilometers deep, get the hot steam up out of the ground, pipe it into the power plant. Then take it into a turbine and generator set and produce electricity. I think it's about 30% of our electricity that comes from geothermal, but over 90% of our heating comes from geothermal. I think the societal benefits of geothermal district heating have been great for my country. The fact that you can heat your home with very little cost all year round. You can bathe. You never run out of hot water. Public swimming pools all over town that are open year round. People waste energy in a way they don't think about how they heat their homes. They know it's green and they know it doesn't cost a lot. Not every country can use geothermal to supply as big a part of its electricity mix with geothermal as we can, but it can play a much bigger role in many countries.
Geothermal makes it possible to grow inside of these greenhouses all through the year. Iceland can produce enough vegetables, peppers, cucumbers, tomatoes, anything that grows inside a greenhouse, we can produce. We have enough geothermal energy, we have enough electricity, and we can even we can produce that much that we can feed a lot of Europe with our growing.
The final step was Iceland's plan to fuel its vehicles with hydrogen.
Just put electricity into water, and that separates water into oxygen and hydrogen. And the hydrogen molecule actually stores the electron. And then you pump the hydrogen into a vehicle and you go through the fuel cell process. But then you can see things dripping from the tailpipe, and that's pure water.
Iceland's government financed a pilot project of hydrogen stations.
We actually realized by using this station with only 30 cars, that if we would have 200 cars, we would actually be running this with a profit. The car manufacturers expected the hydrogen to actually develop faster and the fuel cell would be ready faster. Also the recession we hit, we had a huge problem with the American car manufacturers and so on. There's no profit in building infrastructure when you have no vehicles. That's going to be very costly in the beginning. And the question is, where is that money coming from? So we have the early adopters' disadvantage Everywhere where there has been testing of battery electric vehicles or hydrogen vehicles or any of the new technologies, the public is in general very positive, but sometimes people don't put their money where their mouth is.
Japan is also a volcanic island with great geothermal resources. But for its energy, the country chose nuclear power, despite its history with atomic bombs.
But after the weapons were used in Japan, and after the end of World War II, then people began to want to transition the thinking away from the weapons a little bit, more to what they called peaceful uses.
10,000 scientists and engineers are at work to prove that atomic energy does not mean only the atomic bomb.
And that led, in many ways, to the nuclear power fleet. Most of the reactors that we have were licensed in the early 70s and between then and the early 80s. And they were designed in the 60s. After you paid for the reactor, it's cheap to operate. So that's a big factor in the staying power of nuclear. And the other piece is really the advantages from a climate perspective.
The U.S. government under President Obama launched a program to support the development of nuclear power plants because of climate change. It seemed that finally nuclear power was going to make a big comeback, and you saw around the world a very upbeat view about nuclear power. And that was what people called the nuclear renaissance, where the Chernobyl, the terrible nuclear accident of 1986, was seen as being far in the past. And then came Fukushima.
予測できなかったと、いう問題が一つね。それから2つ目はですね、今まで原子力技術というのはね、担保されてね、それを推進してきたというふうに私も信じていたもんですからね、それが全く裏切られてしまったと。そこでですから非常に大きな反省はね、原子力のようなひとたび事故が起きればね、大変な災害をもたらすような危険な技術をね、人類社会がね、
You've got about 100,000 people who have been forced out of their homes for several years now. Some of them will never be able to return. The communities that existed will never reform. Even if, from a technical and a medical or health perspective, people could come back to the area. And it's a legacy that doesn't just impact the people who've been evacuated. It is impacting their entire economy. I've seen estimates that suggest that the impact would be at least $500 billion. The biggest area where there'll be impact is on the ocean. The expectation is the majority of the contamination went out to the sea. You had a natural event like the tsunami, which to some extent was a localized in time event. It happened and then the waters receded and you had a tremendous tragedy with people dying. Then you had a secondary effect, which was the impact of the nuclear power plant, which is a long-term crisis. So it's almost as if that tsunami has been made to last 40 years. And to think then that it came from a place that was used to generate electricity, it just shows that, in a way, this technology has real fundamental problems that need to be addressed.
Everywhere in the world, people reconsidered nuclear power. Some countries decided to continue, like France. China had a pause and then has renewed it. Finland said yes. Abu Dhabi said yes. Germany said no.
In Germany, it is a deliberate decision to say the future of modern industrial societies is a climate-friendly, decarbonized industry. Why do you harvest energy in such an indirect way? Photosynthesis has an energy efficiency of 1%. So why not using the sunlight directly? It's a no-brainer, really, yeah? Even today, I mean, average efficiency rates are 12%, 15%. Every person on this planet, more or less, has access to that energy. Photosynthesis created life on Earth in the end as we know it. If this is possible to create human civilization based on 1% efficiency, I'm sure we can build it based on 10% efficiency. Again, a no-brainer.
Die Maschine hier und an vergleichbaren Standorten in Deutschland produziert ungefähr 5 bis 6 Millionen Kilowattstunden je nach Windjahr. Ja, unser Ziel ist es eigentlich, dass wir zurzeit alle Privatkunden in unserem in unserem Netzbereich mit elektrischer Energie versorgen können. Das sind 190.000 Haushalte und das schaffen wir zurzeit auch mit unseren insgesamt über 100 Windmühlen, die eine nominelle Ausgangsleistung von 250 Megawatt haben. Wir haben in Deutschland eine Produktion aus der Windenergie heraus, die fast bei 10% liegt. Und von erneuerbaren Energien insgesamt sind wir, glaube ich, bei 27% zurzeit.
Und dann kommt natürlich der Punkt, der Strom kommt natürlich nur, solange die Sonne scheint. Was mache ich nachts, wenn die Sonne weg ist? Und dann kommt eben die Speicherung zu tragen über Batterien. Was wir hier arbeiten, sind Batterien für die Elektromobilität und für stationäre Stromspeicherung. Und man kann das sehr schön machen für einen Haushalt, den Strom speichern über die Nacht. Das ist nicht sehr viel, einige Kilowattstunden reichen da vollkommen aus. Das Spannende ist einfach, dass man das Netz entlastet, dass man also nicht mehr diese großen Schwankungen im Netz hat durch die Photovoltaik, die eingespeist wird. Das macht das Leben der Netzbetreiber sehr viel einfacher. Hinzu kommt,
dass man mit einem Speicher im Haus noch sehr, sehr viel mehr Vorteile generieren kann. Ein schönes Beispiel ist das Thema Blackout. Also wenn das Netz weg ist, dann habe ich trotzdem Strom in meinem Haus und dann bin ich einfach der König. Wenn bei mir der Fernseher funktioniert und das Bier im Kühlschrank kalt ist und meine Nachbarn nichts mehr haben, dann bin ich einfach der Beste im Viertel.
Frankfurt hat einen Masterplan. Wir wollen bis 2050 unsere Energie nur aus nachhaltigen Energiesorten produzieren. Und was wir natürlich machen, das ist das Wichtigste, wir bauen unsere Häuser in einer Passivhausbauweise.
Ein typisches altes Gebäude aus den 50er, 60er Jahren braucht zum Heizen etwa 15 bis 20 Liter Heizöl-Äquivalent pro Quadratmeter und Jahr. Ein typisches Passivhaus benötigt etwa 1,5 Liter Heizöl-Äquivalent pro Quadratmeter und Jahr. Nicht nur in Deutschland sind wir der Meinung, wir brauchen Passivhäuser, um die Zukunft energetisch zu sichern.
Schulen, ja, alle öffentlichen Gebäude, das ist ein Stadtverordnetenbeschluss, den wir seit 2007 schon haben, werden in der Passivhausbauweise gebaut. Am Riedberg mussten alle Häuser in Passivhausbauweise gebaut werden. Das war eine Verpflichtung. Also auch wenn Sie dort eine Fläche erworben haben, um ein Haus zu bauen, konnten Sie das nur in der Passivhausbauweise machen, weil diese Fläche ist der Stadt. Die Kommunen sind für mich der Motor, um dem Klimawandel Einhalt zu gebieten. Ich muss leider sagen, dass ich da nicht so frohen Mutes bin, dass wir unser Ziel erreichen werden, weil die Zeit einfach sehr, sehr schnell voranschreitet. Wie ich schon mal gesagt habe, im Verkehrsbereich, wir haben zwischen 300 und 400.000 Pendler jeden Tag. Wir müssen die Menschen davon überzeugen, von dem Auto runterzugehen, den öffentlichen Personennahverkehr zu nutzen.
Crowded on the roadways right now as you take a look at 10 onto I-95 southbound. Big delays there as you head toward the top of the Full Warren Bridge. Delays on 10 eastbound as well.
ডাবল রাস্তার অভাব, পরিকল্পিত ইন্টারসেকশন আর দরকারি উড়াল সড়ক ও আন্ডারপাস না থাকায়
20-kilometer traffic now from the city.
బైపాస్ రోడ్డు నిర్మాణం పూర్తి కాకపోవడంతో ఈ వెహికల్స్ అన్ని సిటీలోంచి వెళ్లాల్సి ఉంటుంది. దీంతో రవాణా వ్యవస్థ అదుపు తప్పి
You know, my three favorite words in all of this is beware of scale when you're talking about alternatives. I think there's not a chance that collectively renewables can replace the current energy throughput. In 2011, primary energy was 33% oil, 30% coal, 24% gas, 6% large hydro, 4% nuclear, and 1.59% non-hydro renewables. And that includes wind, solar, geothermal, and burning biomass. That's where we're starting from. The biggest piece of the solution is figuring out how to lower our energy throughput a lot without, radically reducing people's standards of living. Not going to be easy. It really needs a new paradigm. You need to look at what's happened with global population. 1860, when we got started on oil, population was about 1.2 billion. When I was born, it was about 2.5 billion. Now we're just over 7 billion people. So it's tripled in my lifetime. The only way we've really got here is because of hydrocarbons. I mean, that was raiding the treasure trove. The so-called Green Revolution that allowed us to triple production of crops like corn and many other crops is based on hydrocarbons. The net energy return on investment for the energy and the food that we eat is about 10 to 1. So 10 parts largely hydrocarbons input, diesel fuel for tractors, nitrogen, fertilizers from natural gas, pesticides, antibiotics. Overall, it's about 10 to 1. If you look at North America, a lot of it was built after cars. And it was built on the assumption of cars.
Modern shopping centers offer the convenience of close-at-hand shopping and ample parking space. The vast sea of houses created by this explosion of the urban population flows outward in endless waves.
We can drive anywhere we want to, at any time, for any reason, including fun.
Now, in our lifetime, comes one of those rare moments when a great door swings open and man enters a new age, the age of the jet.
Yes, the real secret is not only a great source of energy, but also the freedom to make it work for everybody. And using the magic of research, oil companies compete with each other in taking the petroleum molecule apart and rearranging it into, well, you name it, fabrics, toothbrushes, tires, insecticides, cosmetics, weed killers, a whole galaxy of things to make a better life on Earth. And if you have both of these things, any goal is possible. It's Destination Unlimited.
While modern economies grew through energy-intensive consumerism, very few people thought to wonder how long it could last.
Limits to Growth was written 40 years ago in 1972. For the first time in modern history, started the discussion about whether growth is good. Now we are 40 years later, and of course we have learned a lot. We have been increasing income, and particularly among those people that don't need it. You know, the rich consumers, you know, we should have, so we have grown the income, we have grown the population, and we have grown the ecological footprint. Although, in a very silly manner, if you look at this from Spaceship Earth point of view. Don't believe that all growth is good.
And we've had this 200-year pulse of growth that is largely based on carbon. What does that growth lead to? What is it we actually want? The number of brands you're exposed to in a day is some vast number. Whether or not you watch TV, you know, it's just, we're just sort of living in this kind of bath of branding and buying. Our conventional journalistic enterprise, which is a big chunk of what people absorb day to day, is not grappling with these questions. If you look at the history of, let's say, New York Times coverage of environmental problems, or consumption itself has rarely been one of the things people write about. It's a newspaper that sells ads. I don't think there's a conscious disregard for the consumption story, but it's not there.
You know, there's enough in the world maybe for most people's need, but not most people's greed. Even though the greed is what fuels the economy.
And the rising demand isn't coming from Japan, it's not coming from the United States, it's not coming from Western Europe, it's coming from China, India, Middle East itself, Brazil. It's countries that are, because of globalization, are becoming part of the global economy. We went from a situation where 2/3 of world energy was consumed in the industrial countries to now it's about half and half between the developed and the developing countries. So what these numbers tell you is a story, and it's a story about the tremendous economic growth that you're seeing in the emerging markets. It's a story about the shift in the global economy between who manufactures, who consumes. It's a story of needing jobs, needing buildings, housing, needing transportation, all of which takes energy.
Most of that energy is wasted, shed as useless heat that is only visible through infrared.
Your car uses each day about 100 times its weight in ancient plants, and then it is so inefficiently used that only about 0.3% of the oil burned in your car actually moves you as the driver. The rest of it is wasted or moves the heavy steel car.
Why is it that our design standard is not that all homes should be 80% or 90% energy efficient? And by that I mean that 90% of the electricity that they need, they either generate from within or they offset the need for it to begin with. Why isn't that our building standard? And you think about doing it that way, then that's a very different approach. I think we take for granted the electricity that we have, and I do think we don't use it as wisely as we should.
No, I don't notice energy as much as I notice the mortgage payments, the maintenance on the house, the upkeep on the house. I'll tell you, the only time I think about it is, when you hit the peaks and the valleys. So, we went through a really cold winter and we just got our last gas bill. It was huge. And then we noticed there was a significant change. But on a month-to-month basis, no. It doesn't really register as, oh my God, I can't believe what we're paying for hydro or what we're paying for heat.
Do you have to redo the whole class next week, or
actually, if I coach...
So, speaking of programming.
I thought you handled that last night pretty well, Sam.
What happened now that you're in a better frame of mind?
Perfeitamente. Todos, né, desde quando a gente chegou aqui nunca teve energia, então a gente sempre... A primeira coisa é ter algum eletrodoméstico, né, para poder beneficiar. Por exemplo, minha esposa ter mais, poder dizer assim, mais um conforto, né? Porque aqui a gente não tendo energia, não tem como se a gente conservar um alimento. E aí seria eletrodoméstico, um liquidificador.
Fazendo as mesmas coisas e aprofundando as mesmas formas inadequadas de uso dos recursos de uma economia e um desenvolvimento que se baseia muito mais pelo consumo do que pelo bem-estar das pessoas, essa crise só se aprofundará.
I think we're going to have to redefine wealth and poverty. We're going to have to redefine wealth downward and poverty upward. I think that the transition towns are an example of real social change in action.
The transition movement is quite an audacious idea. It's a grassroots-led thing that ordinary people make happen in the place where they live, where they try to build their local economy, decarbonize it, but to see that as a historic opportunity to do something extraordinary. So a transition group is always putting on events, showing films, setting up projects, running events that introduce possibilities into the community's consciousness. So this is the Healthy Futures Garden, and this works with the local doctor's surgery and trains local people who have obesity or heart disease or whatever how to grow food. There's some leeks here, which are a really great kind of winter staple vegetable. So this is red Russian kale, and really, really delicious. We're making a salad. It goes really nicely with this, which is rocket or rucola, they call it in Italy. Totnes spends £30 million a year on food, and of that, 22 million is spent through just 2 supermarkets. So more than half of what we spend on food leaves this town. The upside of that, though, is that a third of what we spend on food we spend in local shops. So our take is that actually that's the foundation on which we build the economy of the future. We run a scheme here called the Totnes Pound, which is a local currency you can only spend in local businesses with local traders.
So these are the new Totnes Pound notes that we will be printing. It's not created out of thin air. It is backed by sterling, and they've got local scenes, and you can use the Totnes Pound in about 70 shops. So the idea of the Totnes Pound, or the idea of local currencies, is to keep money in the local community, because of course you can't take a Totnes Pound and spend it in London.
Everybody's happy. Brilliant, thanks very much.
I think the incentive is just feeling that you're doing something for your local community.
So what you can see on the big building over there, that's the Civic Hall, and the solar panels on the roof of that were put in place by TTT. And the idea is that the money that's generated from the electricity there goes into energy efficiency fund for both for the building and for further afield in the town. One of the key things we've done here is called Transition Streets. So Transition Streets says, get a group of people on your street together, knock on the doors, do you want to be part of this? You meet 7 times in each other's houses. The first time you get to know each other. The rest of the times, one week you talk about water, another week you talk about energy.
And then you make pledges of things you're going to do at the end of each session.
If we'd been told at the start of joining this group, you must put solar panels on your roof, we would have not even started. But the first thing we did was, oh, let's change a few light bulbs. Let's get a water bath. Oh, let's do a bit more recycling. And then as we discussed and we had ideas among one another, the idea of solar came out. And at the end of the course, we had actually put solar panels on our roof, but we were taken there a bit at a time. That tells me how much CO2 we've avoided. It tells me how much I've avoided today and how much I've avoided over the time I've had these panels. I'm more encouraged to have a go at taking green initiatives because my friends are there encouraging me into it. And I haven't got to take the initiative on my own. I've got someone there helping me along. Yeah,
it became a fun thing to do, didn't it? It was like working as a team.
Yes.
And that's nice. And it's taking on things that you wouldn't normally have taken on.
A lot of what transition does goes on underneath the radar. It's about rebuilding relationships and connections and kind of inspiring people in ways that actually you don't see when you just first come and walk around the town.
I'm trying to be not part of the cash economy, so I fix bikes for pies or for fruit. Someone said he'd write me a poem. He wrote me this beautiful poem, and that's a very rich exchange.
Nobody knows how you decarbonise and reduce the oil dependency and build the resilience of community after community across the world. But the only way to figure it out is by not waiting for anyone's permission, but by having a go and starting to do it. And there's now transition groups in 44 countries, in thousands of communities around the world, and together we're figuring this out.
Es kann auf diesem Planeten nichts geschehen, das die anderen nicht auch in irgendeiner Weise betrifft. Mein letzter Flug war ein Flug über einen Monat lang mit den Russen auf dem Meer. Man macht sich im extremen Maße davon abhängig, dass die technischen Systeme funktionieren und dass die Mitflieger keine Fehler machen. Und deswegen spielt eigentlich diese Herkunft keine Rolle mehr. Es ist, woher der Pass stammt, nicht relevant in der Flugsituation. Die Grenzen, die sind eigentlich, soweit es die Natur betrifft, nicht da. Und sie sind Grenzen, die der Mensch gemacht hat.
In the world, we have 192 captains, all the heads of state. The main challenge is for them to agree on what direction to send the ship. We already have the technologies that are necessary to solve the problem. So the problem is not lack of technology, lack of money, it is the lack of will. It's very difficult for humanity, for global society, to decide exactly what to do.
One of the most intricate patterns of all is our civilization. We are the complex system also. I mean, it's a wrong thinking, and I guess in systems theory you go beyond, where you say, here is the system and here am I, so to speak. Or it's capitalism, communism, the economy, whatever, and here it's me. The interesting thing is that the individual particles create the system, and the system at the same time is influencing the individual particles. So we have to think in interactions rather than linear cause-effect relationships. I think that's the big paradigm shift, really.
For the last 50 years, our culture has been highly individualistic. All of the narratives we tell each other are focused on people as individuals, striving to maximize their self-interest. And what's amazing is that it turns out that the human evolutionary story is also one of highly cooperative groups. To tell that story, we have to begin with what makes our group so different than the average primate group. There's two ways to succeed if you're a social animal. You can succeed at the expense of your group members, or you could succeed as a group compared to other groups. The current thinking is that what makes our species so different than other primate species is that mechanisms evolved that suppressed our ability to gain at the expense of each other within groups. And so therefore, we had to succeed as teams. Human society is more like social insect colonies than we ever knew. So this has been a metaphorical comparison for a millennia. What's new is that it's scientifically validated during the last 10 or 20 years. Often people associate evolution with competition. Evolution is just as much about cooperation, and typically cooperation is required before competition. And so most of what we regard as distinctively human in terms of our minds, such as language, symbolic thought, and also cultural transmission, are all forms of cooperation that required a kind of intelligence predicated on trust. This became a new evolutionary process where we could now adapt to our environments much more quickly because what we learned we could share and we could transmit. And it's at that point that our ancestors could spread out of Africa and adapt to all of the different climatic zones and hundreds of ecological niches.
The other great scientific revelation that will be spoken about 3,000 years hence is the fact that we are all literally brothers and sisters. Studies of the human genome leave no doubt whatsoever that race is an utter fiction. The human genetic endowment is a continuum. Indeed, all of us are descended from a handful of hominids who walked out of the Rift Valley some 60,000 years ago. But the fascinating thing about that revelation is that if you accept that we're all cut from the same genetic cloth, by definition, every culture shares the same raw genius.
Yet we all look a little different because we were colored by our place in the sun.
In some senses, the people in different parts of the earth are genetically different from each other. Of course, skin pigmentation is an awesome example of that. If you live in a very sunny place, then you need dark skin. Are you still getting enough to manufacture vitamin D? If you're living in a cloudier place, then you need to be lighter skin, but then you get seasonal changes. Then your skin pigmentation needs to track the seasonal changes. And so that's what sun tanning is.
We now understand that we began to change our relationship with the sun a long time ago.
The passenger cabin was the Earth uninfluenced by humans with wild plant and animal species. The big change 13,000 years ago was the origins of agriculture, the development of agriculture or food production. There was just much more food available for us, and so the result was population explosion, food surpluses, technology, writing, empires, invention, everything interesting. It meant that human impact on Earth was far greater. Several thousand people require more resources. They use more soil. They require more water. They use the land more intensively. The Maya were the most advanced civilization in the New World. They chopped down their forests. The result was soil erosion, reducing their own potential to grow food. There were too many people for the landscape to support. What could have saved the Maya civilization from collapse is doing something different 50 years before that. Collapses often develop rather rapidly when a society is at its peak. The Maya thought that everything was going wonderfully, and it was, but they did not recognize the warning signs for the future.
This is very illustrative of the problems we have on Spaceship Earth. Even though we have worked for 20 years, to try to agree on a carbon tax, we have not managed to agree.
Our children's children will read about the spirit of Kyoto and remember well the place and the time where humankind first chose to embark together on a long-term sustainable relationship between our civilization and the Earth's environment.
We feel that we should follow the stipulation in the convention to have an annual meeting, because there are many questions to be discussed in COP.
It gives me great pleasure to welcome you to the 6th Conference of Parties to the United Nations Framework Convention on Climate Change.
Mr. President, Saudi Arabia strongly opposed that proposal to give Canada an additional 70 million tons of CO2.
Let us all capitalize on the goodwill present in this room.
It gives me great pleasure to declare open the 13th session.
It gives me great pleasure to declare open the 14th session.
In addressing climate change, it is inadmissible to undermine the efforts of developing countries to get rid of poverty and backwardness.
We know the fault lines because we've been imprisoned by them for years. These international discussions have essentially taken place now for almost 2 decades. And we have very little to show for it other than an increase, acceleration of the climate change phenomenon. The time for talk is over.
I would call it a tragedy of the commons. We have this global commons, this place where we put all of our carbon dioxide emissions, and we know we shouldn't be doing it. But if I don't do it, someone in Japan will do it, or someone in China might do it. So why should I stop? So we all want to blame someone else.
We hope Cancun signifies a major step in action to deal with the challenge of climate change. It gives me great pleasure to declare open the 19th Convention on climate change.
We're more motivated to fight a human enemy than we are to fight something abstract and diffuse, such as climate change. And it's very sobering when you think of it, that altruism at one scale turns into selfishness up the ladder. So when I'm looking out for myself, that could be bad for my group. If I'm looking out for my group, that could be bad for my clan. If I'm looking out for my clan, that could be bad for my nation. If I'm looking out for my nation, that could be bad for the worldwide economy. So goodness turns into evil.
All groups share that evolutionary instinct, including corporations.
Well, it's no secret that a number of Western democracies run on donations from large corporations. Campaigns in the US especially are very dollar intensive. And the fossil fuel industry has been ponying up for years. They're one of the largest contributors to politicians. They hire some of the best lobbyists in DC to do their bidding. They have a lot of entrenched interests in Congress, and they're going to fight like heck to defend them.
I would say the extractive industries, oil, coal, gas, as well as nuclear interests and all the rest, they do everything. They buy the politicians. They also work through the public, the mind of the public, to try to create the political demand for the agenda that they have.
Koch Industries started in the heartland.
Take Charles and David Koch, for instance, the two owners of Koch Industries, a large private conglomerate. They refine oil and gas.
Together, we are Koch.
I did visit the David H. Koch Hall of Human Origins, and I was surprised by how front and center the messaging around climate seemed to be. They were asserting that humankind has survived all sorts of temperature shifts for thousands of years and insinuating that we're going to be able to weather climate change like it's just a normal thing when it's, in fact, historically unprecedented. I think the fact that the Hall of Human Origin is hosted by the Smithsonian really helps give it a serious sense of legitimacy. What they do is they place the question in your mind, is it a hoax?
Homo sapiens experienced large changes in climate. Early humans met the challenges they faced by being adaptable, caring for the young, using fire, and building shelters. Come explore the evidence.
These are the people who are profiting off of wrecking our climate. 350 parts per million is the safe upper limit of carbon in the atmosphere. Right now, we're at 400, much higher than the atmospheric conditions on which civilization developed and that life on Earth is dependent on. What would it take to get back to 350? A lot of work, but it's not insurmountable, and it's worth the price. It would mean decarbonizing the entire planet. In the near term, it means taking all the fossil fuel reserves we have, all the fossil fuel reserves accounted for by coal, oil, and gas companies, and leaving 80% of those in the ground. For our divestment campaigns, we're targeting the top 200 carbon producers on Earth. We want to revoke their social license to do business as usual, the same way that social movements have done that with tobacco, with slavery, with other issues. We know that culture moves politics, not the other way around. From a global perspective, young people are seen as a moral voice across cultures. And I think that's really important here because that's our upper hand. We do have moral clarity to what we're asking for. We just want a planet with the same climate we've always had. Once we start thinking about this in terms of right and wrong, that's when I think we'll see the political breakthroughs.
If you look at climate change alone, then the CO2 footprint of today is unsustainable. But progress has been very questionable. And in any of our scenarios currently, the climate change will go well beyond the 2 degrees of global warming that is seen as the maximum that the world can handle. The energy mix of the world over the decades will change. Change in such a big system is slow, and it will take many decades for it to reform itself. The relative quantities will shift more towards gas, more towards renewables, as the world continues on a sustainable path. So I see oil as part of a sustainable future.
The Obama administration's tentatively approved Shell's plans to begin oil extraction off the Alaskan coast this summer. Federal scientists estimate the Arctic region contains up to 15 billion barrels of oil, and Shell has long fought to drill in the icy waters of the Chukchi Sea. Shell said, quote, "We remain committed to operating in a safe, environmentally responsible manner and look forward to exploring our Chukchi leases in the weeks to come."
A big problem in the past is the conflict between the long-term interests of any society and the short-term interests from some people who profit by doing things that are bad for the society. Those are the several reasons why, at their peak, these societies did not see what was happening to them and did not take corrective action. So who is there today in the modern world who's pursuing short-term goals? And a short answer is most of us are pursuing short-term goals.
So we live in a pathological society, in part because we have a narrative that pretends if we all just maximize our appetites, then the society will work well. There is a sense in which a society can function well without its members having the welfare of the society in mind. We could be concerned mostly about our own reputations, for example. And yet, in order to have a good reputation, we have to do good things for the group. But it's very different than the received economic version, which pretends that if individuals just strive to maximize their monetary gain and you have no restrictions, then society is going to work well. That has to be the most toxic metaphor that's ever been unleashed upon society.
It's possible to get pessimistic and to focus on the bad stories of the societies that collapsed. But some societies have not collapsed, partly because of good luck, that they were living in robust areas, and partly because they made far-sighted decisions to avoid damaging their environments. Japan, during the Tokugawa era, the shogun gave orders that the forest be conserved, but that order would not have been obeyed unless the Japanese people were receptive to preserving their own environment and their own forest.
Tokugawa, also called the Edo period, began in 1603. It established an ethic of conservation that lasted until the late 19th century.
そういうシステムを作ってました。で、この油をこう絞った後のカスがあるんですが、そのカスは今度はでそういう価値観のことを考えますと、例えば「足るを知る」という言葉がありますけれども、まさにこう自分たちの暮らしの中でこれで十分だっていう気持ちをいつも持っているんですね。でそうしますと来年の恵みは今年と同じでいいわけです。つまり右肩上がりじゃなくてもいいわけですね。で十分であるということをとにかく継続していきたいという、そういう価値観がとてもはっきりとしていると思います。その状態を次の世代に、渡そうとする、そういう意識があると思われます。ですから幸せの意味が物を持つ方ではなくて、消費をする方ではなくて、人間関係の方にあったというふうに考えることができます。やはりその西欧列強に入っていくっていう明治になって、で西欧列強に入っていくっていうことは 外に向かって拡大して物を得ていくっていうことなんですね。で資源を外から買う、で市場を外に求める、でそのために戦争をするってね、日露と戦争をずっと経験して第二次世界大戦まで行きますね。
私たちはですね、産業が爆発的に発展して、そして自分たちの生活がですね物質的には豊かになるおかげでですね、もしかしたらこれは全部自分たちの人間の力でそういうことができているんではないか、そういうようなですね過信をしてしまいました。しかし近年のですね地球環境問題、あるいは3.11などの災害はですね、いや実はそんなことはなくてですね、私たちがまだまだそういったものの方がはるかに自分たちにとって本質的に重要なことなんだということに気づいたと思います。
When it unfolded, the jaw-dropping nature of what those waves did was stunning. But then I also focused in on this astonishing, sobering reality that there were these tsunami stones that had been erected in the hills there in centuries past. The inscriptions are just haunting. One of them says, "Do not build below this stone. Remember the great waves of the past." In Japan, where they knew there's a history of great tsunamis, but the engineers who designed the nuclear power plant and the vital systems put the generators in places that could be flooded and stuff like that. You say, hello, what is it about us? The more we recognize our own traits and patterns of behavior, the more apt we are to be able to build into our norms as individuals, as families, and then as communities, the capacity to say, at least some of the time, that we need to be making this decision based on a longer time scale. It's not just about the near and the now, it's about the global and the long. So that takes it also into this other special realm, the realm of values. You can't solve the global warming problem or related issues with just technology or just rules if you don't have people's values evolve.
日本の伝統の宗教ね、神道も仏教もそうですが、全てのものには命が宿るという考え方はね、これは遅れた、非常に発展段階の遅れた宗教の特徴ではなくてね、極めて先進的な、そういうことも考えなくちゃいけないのかと思い出すわけで、ですからここの製品、技術、社会制度をはじめね、20年くらい前はね、まだfrom cradle to grave っていう言葉を使ってたんですよね。これはもう21世紀入ってですね、この from cradle to cradle っていう言葉に変わってきましてね、これはゆりかごからね、次のゆりかごまでっていう言葉なんですよ。そのエコ文明を建設するべき時期に来てると思うんですね、この21世紀は。
Imagine this. The scientists studying Spaceship Earth have finally discovered the answer to an ancient question. What is the purpose of our journey?
Ich meine, dass die bemannte Raumfahrt, die ja vor 50 Jahren oder mehr als 50 Jahren begann, ein Ergebnis erbrachte, das ist vielleicht das Wichtigste überhaupt, nämlich die Erkenntnis, dass die Erde unvergleichliche Qualitäten für den Menschen bietet und dass es darauf ankommt, dass es eine ethische Pflicht gibt, diese Erde zu beschützen, um sie den Nichtgeborenen intakt zu hinterlassen.
Do we know the way forward? I think there's a sense in which we do know the way forward. We're trying to create a planetary organism. Somehow we have to get the entire human population on the planet to function as a group. Left unmanaged, evolution is going to take us where we don't want to go. Our influence on the biosphere and our cultural evolutionary processes are going to take us where we don't want to go. That is, I think, is a conclusion. For all that we don't know, we do know that. So how do we do this at a worldwide scale? Well, metaphors, stories, framing, all of this is important. Let's call the Earth Spaceship Earth. So now we can see ourselves in a part of a spaceship. And there's a vulnerability there. If the spaceship malfunctions, then huge consequences. Let's say something like there's no passengers, only crew. What does that mean? It means basically we all have to chip in here. Can we create a narrative so that that becomes the norm? So not just is it captivating at a psychological level, but that if you actually deviate from that and you become a passenger, other people will say, wait a minute, you need to become part of the crew.
Je regarde la salle, je vois que la réaction est positive, je n'entends pas d'objection. L'accord de Paris pour le climat est accepté.